The rain had turned the training grounds into a mirror of mud and blood, reflecting a sky that seemed to hold its breath. I could taste copper on my tongue. Whether from the split in my lip or the metallic air itself, I couldn't tell anymore. My arms trembled as I raised the wooden practice sword again, the weight of it feeling like an anchor dragging me down into the earth. Again! Commander Thorne's voice cut through the downpour, sharp and unforgiving. I wanted to tell him I couldn't, that my muscles had stopped obeying me 3 rounds ago, that the other recruits, strong, trained, born into warrior families, were watching from the covered pavilion with expressions ranging from pity to poorly concealed amusement. But words required energy I didn't have, so I simply repositioned my feet in the slick mud and tried to remember the defensive stance he'd shown us that morning. The garrison at Northridge was never meant to be my home. I'd arrived 6 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desperate need to disappear. The kingdom's recruitment notices had promised shelter, food, and purpose to anyone willing to serve. They hadn't mentioned that anyone was a theoretical concept, or that a girl with wheat-colored hair tangled from weeks of travel, hollow cheeks, and trembling hands would be seen as a mistake the moment she walked through those gates. Your footwork is sloppy, Thorne circled me like a wolf assessing wounded prey. You're favoring your left side. An enemy would exploit that in seconds. I knew. God, I knew. But knowing and fixing were separated by an ocean of exhaustion and years of malnutrition that had left my body more fragile than I wanted to admit. Still, I adjusted, shifting my weight even as my right ankle screamed in protest. The practice dummy before me was supposed to represent an enemy soldier. In my blurring vision, it became something else. The face of the man who'd destroyed my village. The flames that had consumed everything. The screams that still woke me gasping in the darkness. My next strike came harder than intended, the impact reverberating up my arms until my shoulders burned. Better, Thorne admitted grudgingly, but better won't keep you alive again. The other recruits had been dismissed an hour ago. I could feel their eyes still on me from whatever warm corner they'd retreated to, could imagine their whispered conversations. Why does he waste time on her? She'll never make it. She doesn't belong here. They were probably right. My next swing went wide, and I stumbled, catching myself on one knee in the mud. The rain plastered my hair to my face, and for a moment, I stayed there, head bowed, wondering if I should just surrender, go back to... What? There was nothing to go back to. No family. No home. No name that mattered to anyone. On your feet, recruit. Thorne's voice had shifted, losing some of its harsh edge. When I looked up, his weathered face showed something that might have been concern, quickly masked. He was a hard man, shaped by decades of war, but not a cruel one. That made it worse somehow, knowing that his relentlessness came from a genuine desire to prepare me for a world that would show no mercy. I rose, legs shaking, and raised the sword once more. That's when the horns sounded. 3 long blasts echoed across the garrison. A pattern I'd learned meant only one thing. Important visitors approaching. The kind that made commanders straighten their uniforms, and recruits scramble to look presentable. Through the rain, I could hear the sudden flurry of activity. Doors slamming, orders being shouted, boots running across stone. Thorne's expression transformed from instructor to soldier in an instant. Inside, now. Clean yourself up as best you can and stay out of sight. Why? That's an order, recruit. Move. I'd learned not to question direct orders. I retrieved my practice sword, muscles protesting every movement, and headed toward the barracks. But curiosity, that dangerous, persistent trait that had gotten me into trouble my entire life, made me slow my pace as I passed the main courtyard. Through the rain, I could see them arriving. Riders emerged from the tree line like shadows given form, at least 50 of them, mounted on horses that looked bred for war. They moved with a precision that made our garrison troops look like children playing soldier. These were real warriors, the kind whose very presence changed the air pressure in a room. But it was the man at the front who made my breath catch. Even at a distance, even through sheets of rain, he commanded attention in a way that felt almost supernatural. He sat his black war horse like he'd been born in the saddle, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a face that could have been carved from stone. He wore no crown, but he didn't need one. Authority rolled off him in waves, making even Commander Thorne look diminished as he hurried out to greet the arrivals. I should have kept walking, should have disappeared into the barracks like I'd been ordered, but my feet had stopped obeying me, rooted to the muddy ground as I watched the exchange in the courtyard. "Your Majesty," Thorne's voice carried despite the rain, formal and rigid. "We weren't expecting an inspection," the king, interrupted, his voice deep and resonant, unannounced. "I want to see how my border garrisons truly operate, not how they perform when given time to prepare." The Alpha King. I'd heard stories, of course, everyone had. Dmitry Volkov, crowned 5 years ago after his father's sudden death, known for being ruthless in battle and impossible to read in court. They said he could break a man with a look, that he'd unified the fractured northern territories through a combination of strategic brilliance and sheer intimidating presence. They said a lot of things, most of which I'd dismissed as the usual embellishments that surrounded powerful men. Looking at him now, I wondered how much of it was true. "Of course, Your Majesty," Thorne was saying. "We're honored. If you'd like to review our—" "What's that?" The king's question cut through Thorne's prepared speech. He was looking past the commander, past the assembled troops, directly at me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to become invisible the way I'd learned to as a child, but his gaze held me pinned like a butterfly on a board, and I found I couldn't move at all. "A recruit, Your Majesty," Thorne said quickly, and I could hear the apology already forming in his tone. "New, still in training. She's covered in mud and looks ready to collapse," the king observed, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Not disgust, not pity, something else. "How long has she been training?" 2 hours, Your Majesty. She requires additional practice." The king dismounted in one fluid motion, and suddenly the distance between us began to shrink as he walked forward. His soldiers followed, forming a loose semicircle behind him, and I became acutely aware of how I must look. Soaked, filthy, trembling with exhaustion, clutching a practice sword like a lifeline. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough that I could see his eyes were a startling shade of amber, like honey held up to sunlight. Close enough that I could see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a mark of violence that somehow made him more imposing rather than less. 2 hours in the rain, he said, and though he was speaking to Thorne, his eyes never left mine. "Alone?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" The question hung in the air. I could feel the weight of attention from the king's entire company, dozens of elite warriors now focused on this strange tableau. My pride, that stubborn, foolish thing that had kept me standing when everything else said to fall, finally sparked to life. "Because I need to be better," I heard myself say, my voice hoarse but steady. "Sir." The king's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those amber eyes, interest, perhaps, or calculation. When he spoke again, it was directly to me. "Show me." "Your Majesty?" Thorne sounded alarmed. "Perhaps it would be better to—" "I want to see what 2 hours of extra training produces," the king said calmly. "Demonstrate your skills, recruit, against one of my men." The courtyard fell silent, except for the rain. I knew what this was: a test, an entertainment, possibly a humiliation. A king and his elite warriors wanted to see the struggling girl perform, probably to confirm their assumptions about who belonged in military service and who didn't. I should have refused. Should have found some diplomatic way to extract myself from this situation. But looking at those amber eyes, I saw something that ignited a different kind of fire in my chest. Not cruelty. Challenge. He didn't think I'd accept. "Yes, sir," I said, and turned to face the practice grounds. One of the king's soldiers stepped forward, a man nearly twice my size, built like a mountain, with scars that told stories of real battles. He drew his practice sword with casual confidence, the kind that came from never doubting you'd win. I was going to lose. We both knew it. Everyone watching knew it, but maybe, just maybe, I could make it interesting. I raised my sword, adjusted my stance the way Thorne had been drilling into me for weeks, and waited. The rain continued to fall, washing away the mud, washing away everything except this moment. This choice. This chance to prove that I was more than the broken girl who'd stumbled into this garrison hoping to disappear. The soldier moved first, and the world narrowed to the clash of wood against wood, the burn in my muscles, the desperate need to stay standing just one more second, one more breath, one more heartbeat. And through it all, I felt the weight of the Alpha King's gaze, watching, measuring, seeing something in me that I desperately hoped was there. I lasted longer than anyone expected. The soldier, I later learned his name was Garrett, came at me with the kind of restrained aggression that suggested he was trying not to hurt me too badly. That restraint was the only reason I survived the first 30 seconds. I parried, dodged, gave ground when I had to, and somehow managed to keep the practice sword in my trembling hands. But restraint only goes so far. His fourth strike knocked my blade aside, and the fifth caught me in the ribs. A controlled blow that still drove the air from my lungs and sent me stumbling backward. I should have fallen then. My body was screaming at me to just drop, to surrender, to end this humiliating display. Instead, I found my footing and raised the sword again. Something changed in Garrett's expression. Respect, maybe, or confusion that I kept getting up. We circled each other in the rain, and I tried to remember everything Thorn had drilled into me. Watch the shoulders, not the blade. They telegraph the strike. Keep your center low. Conserve energy. Pick your moments. When Garrett came at me again, I didn't try to match his strength. Instead, I slipped sideways at the last second, letting his momentum carry him past me, and managed a glancing blow to his shoulder. It wouldn't have hurt a child, but it landed, and I heard a murmur run through the watching soldiers. Clever. The king's voice cut through the rain, and I couldn't tell if he was pleased or merely making an observation. Garrett wasn't playing anymore. His next combination was faster, harder, the kind of assault that would end the fight. I blocked the first strike, barely deflected the second, and took the third on my forearm with a crack that made my vision white out for a moment. The sword fell from my numb fingers, and Garrett's blade stopped an inch from my throat. Yield, he said, not unkindly. I should have. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to yield, but there was another part, deeper and more primal, that refused to give voice to that word. Instead, I looked past the blade at his face and shook my head. Garrett's eyes widened slightly. He glanced toward the king, clearly uncertain how to proceed. You couldn't keep striking someone who'd been disarmed, but I hadn't surrendered either. Stop. The king's command was absolute. Garrett immediately lowered his weapon and stepped back, offering me a hand up that I was too proud to take. I rose on my own, cradling my injured arm against my chest, and met the king's gaze. He was studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his face, and water ran down the scar on his cheek, but he seemed utterly unbothered by the weather. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the courtyard. What's your name, recruit? Elena Winters, sir. My voice came out steadier than I felt. How long have you been training, Elena Winters? 6 weeks, sir. A ripple of surprise moved through his soldiers. 6 weeks against a man who'd been fighting for years. The fact that I'd lasted more than a few seconds suddenly seemed more impressive, or perhaps more foolish. And before that, the question felt loaded, like he already knew the answer, but wanted to hear me say it. Before that, I had no training, sir. No weapons experience. No. I paused, choosing my words carefully. No advantages. Yet you're here. Yes, sir. Why? It was the second time he'd asked me why, and I sensed that this man didn't waste words on idle curiosity. He wanted the truth, and somehow I knew he'd recognize a lie immediately, so I gave him what I'd barely admitted to myself. Because I have nowhere else to go, I said quietly, and because I refused to be helpless again. The silence that followed felt charged, electric. The king continued to study me, and I forced myself not to look away, not to show the terror that was creeping up my spine. This man could have me thrown out with a word, could have me imprisoned for speaking too boldly to royalty, could end my fragile attempt at building a new life before it truly began. Instead, he turned to Commander Thorn. How does she perform in other areas? Strategy? Academics? Thorn looked surprised by the question. She's Exceptionally quick with tactical exercises, Your Majesty. Top of her instruction group in map reading and battlefield analysis. Her written assessments show clear thinking under pressure. He paused, then added with obvious reluctance, "It's only the physical aspects where she struggles." "Because she's malnourished and exhausted," the king said flatly. It wasn't a question. How much combat training did the others have before arriving? Most come from military families, Your Majesty. They've been preparing since childhood. The king nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone present. He walked to where I'd dropped my practice sword, picked it up, and came to stand directly before me. This close, I could smell leather and rain, and something else. Smoke, maybe, or pine. "Raise your arm," he said. I didn't understand, but I obeyed, lifting my uninjured left arm. He placed the sword in my hand, then stepped back and drew his own practice blade from Garrett's belt. "Again," he said simply. The courtyard erupted in barely suppressed murmurs. Commander Thorne actually took a step forward, then caught himself, clearly uncertain whether protocol allowed him to question his king. I stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The Alpha King wanted to spar with me. With me. A half-starved recruit who'd been barely standing before he arrived. "Your Majesty," I began, but he cut me off. "You refuse to yield," he said, and there was something almost like approval in his voice. "So we continue. Unless you'd like to surrender now?" It was a challenge and a test, and possibly a trap all at once. But there was something in his eyes, that same spark I'd seen before. That flicker of interest. That made me think he genuinely wanted to see what I would do. I raised the sword, adjusted my stance, and nodded. He came at me like a storm. The difference between Garrett and the king was the difference between a candle and a wildfire. Every movement was precise, controlled, devastating. He could have ended the fight in seconds, but instead he pushed me, testing my limits, forcing me to react faster than I thought possible. When I tried the same sidestep that had worked before, he was already there, anticipating. When I attempted a desperate counterattack, he turned it aside almost casually. But here's what I noticed. He was teaching me. Each exchange showed me something new. How to better angle my blade where I was leaving myself open. How to read the micro movements that telegraphed his next strike. He was dismantling my defenses. Yes, but he was also showing me exactly how he did it. My body was failing. My arms felt like lead. My legs threatened to buckle with every step. But my mind was crystal clear, absorbing every lesson, cataloging every technique. When he finally disarmed me, a quick twist that sent my sword spinning away, I was already analyzing what I'd done wrong. This time, when I hit the mud, I didn't try to get up immediately. I stayed on my hands and knees, gasping for air, vision blurring at the edges. I'd reached my absolute limit, and then surpassed it. The king sheathed his practice blade and crouched down beside me, close enough that his voice was for my ears alone. "You learn faster than anyone I've seen in years," he said quietly. "But your body can't support what your mind understands. It will, with proper training and proper food. The question is whether you have the patience to get there." I looked up at him, rain and exhaustion making everything feel surreal. "I'll do whatever it takes." Something shifted in his expression. Approval, definitely. But also something more complicated. Understanding, perhaps. Like he recognized something in me that echoed something in himself. He stood and addressed Commander Thorne in a voice that carried authority like thunder. "This recruit shows exceptional promise. See that she receives appropriate support. Increased rations, modified training schedule to allow for recovery, access to advanced tactical instruction." He paused, then added, "I want monthly reports on her progress." Thorne snapped to attention. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king looked down at me one more time, and I could have sworn I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Get up, Elena Winters. That's an order." So I did. My legs shook and my vision swam, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But I got to my feet and stood at attention as best I could. The king nodded once, approving, then turned to his assembled troops. "We ride on," he announced. "Commander Thorne, prepare a full report on garrison readiness for my review. Just like that, the moment was over. The king mounted his horse with fluid grace, his soldiers falling into formation around him. Within minutes, they were riding back toward the trees, leaving behind only hoofprints in the mud and a garrison full of people staring at me like I'd suddenly grown wings. Commander Thorne approached slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well?" he said finally. That was unexpected. I started to laugh, then stopped because it hurt too much. "Permission to go collapse somewhere, sir?" "Granted, but first..." He paused, studying me with new eyes. "The king doesn't give orders like that lightly. Whatever he saw in you, don't waste it." "I won't, sir." That night, lying in my bunk with bandages wrapped around my ribs and arm, I replayed every moment of the encounter. The other recruits gave me a wide berth, uncertain how to treat someone who'd suddenly become interesting to royalty. I was grateful for the space. My body needed rest, but my mind was racing. The Alpha King had seen something in me. Not pity. I'd seen pity before, knew what it looked like. This was different. He'd recognized something fundamental, some quality he valued, and decided I was worth investing in. I thought about the way he'd moved, the precision and power in every strike. Thought about the scar on his face and wondered what battle had put it there. Thought about the loneliness I'd glimpsed in those amber eyes, just for a moment, before he'd hidden it away, and I thought about the fact that he'd ordered monthly reports on my progress. Which meant, in some small way, my success or failure now mattered to the king himself. The pressure should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like possibility. For the first time since the night my village burned, since I'd lost everything and everyone I'd ever known, I felt something other than survival instinct driving me forward. I felt purpose. I would train. I would improve. I would become the soldier he'd seen the potential for in that muddy courtyard. Not because I owed him, though perhaps I did, but because he'd given me something more valuable than orders or resources. He'd given me a reason to believe I could be more than I was. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and through the small window above my bunk, I could see stars beginning to emerge from behind the clouds. I watched them, until exhaustion finally dragged me under. And for once, my dreams were of possibilities, rather than nightmares. 3 months changed everything. The increased rations filled out the hollow places in my cheeks, added strength to muscles that had been wasting away. The modified training schedule, early mornings with Thorne working on technique, afternoons studying tactics and strategy, evenings devoted to controlled sparring, transformed my body from liability to weapon, slowly. Painfully, but undeniably. The other recruits' attitudes shifted too. Some resented the special attention, whispered that I'd charmed the king somehow, used feminine wiles to gain advantage. Others, seeing how brutally I pushed myself every single day, began to respect the work if not the circumstances. A few even became something close to friends. "You're favoring your right side again," Sarah called out during morning drills. She was a blacksmith's daughter, built solid and strong, with a practical streak that I'd come to appreciate. "Rotate your hips more," I adjusted, drove my practice sword through the sequence again, felt the difference immediately. Better? Better. Though if Thorne catches you slacking on that footwork, he'll have you running laps until sunset. I grinned, despite myself. The fear that had defined my early weeks here had gradually been replaced by something more complex. Determination, camaraderie, and beneath it all, a constant awareness that I was being watched. Not just by Thorne and the garrison, but by distant eyes I couldn't see. The king's monthly reports, I never saw them, never knew exactly what Thorne wrote, but I felt their weight every day. Felt it in the extra attention my instructors gave me, in the way visiting officers would pause to observe my training, in the knowledge that my progress or failure would be noted and recorded and sent to someone who, for reasons I still didn't fully understand, cared about the outcome. It should have been crushing pressure. Instead, it became fuel. "Elena," Thorne's voice cut across the training grounds. Front and center. I jogged over, Sarah trailing behind. The commander stood with 2 men I didn't recognize. both wearing the silver insignia of the Royal Guard. My stomach tightened. "Sir?" "These are Captains Morrison and Reeves from the Capitol. They're conducting advanced training exercises and requested our best tactical minds." Thorne's expression was carefully neutral. "You've been selected to participate." The two captains studied me with undisguised skepticism. Morrison, the older of the two, had gray threading through his beard and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too many battles. Reeves was younger, sharp-eyed, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested military academy training. "This is your best?" Reeves asked, not bothering to hide his doubt. "One of them," Thorne said mildly. "You asked for innovation and unconventional thinking. Recruit Winters excels in both areas." Morrison stepped closer, circling me the way a buyer might inspect a horse. "You're the one the king took an interest in." It wasn't a question. My reputation, it seemed, had spread beyond Northridge. "I'm one of many soldiers serving His Majesty, sir." Diplomatic answer. Morrison's eyes crinkled slightly. "Let's see if you're as clever as Thorne claims." Captain Reeves explained the scenario. What followed was 3 hours of intensive tactical exercises that made my regular training look simple by comparison. They presented impossible scenarios, outnumbered forces, limited resources, hostile terrain, and demanded solutions. Not textbook answers, but creative thinking that might actually work in real combat. I thrived. While other selected recruits froze or offered conventional strategies, I found myself thinking 3 moves ahead, spotting opportunities others missed, suggesting combinations of terrain advantage and psychological warfare that made even Morrison raise his eyebrows. "You'd sacrifice the high ground?" Reeves challenged during one scenario. "Every tactical manual says—" "The manuals assume your enemy has read the same books," I interrupted, then caught myself. "Sir, if they expect us to hold high ground, we use that expectation against them. Let them commit to an assault on an important position we've already abandoned. Meanwhile, our real force hits their supply lines." Silence. Then Morrison laughed, a rough sound like gravel shifting. "She's right. Unorthodox, risky as hell, but right." He made a note on his tablet. "The king's intuition continues to prove accurate." By the time they dismissed us, I was mentally exhausted, but exhilarated. Sarah caught up with me as we headed toward the mess hall. "That was incredible," she said, shaking her head in wonder. "You were suggesting strategies I've never even heard of. Where did you learn to think like that?" I didn't have a good answer. The truth was that tactics came naturally to me in a way physical combat never had. Maybe it was growing up in a small village where you learn to stretch resources and think creatively just to survive. Maybe it was having spent years being underestimated, learning to see angles others missed. Or maybe it was something else entirely, some innate gift I'd never had the chance to develop until desperation drove me here. "I just see the patterns," I said finally. "The way pieces fit together or don't." Sarah was about to respond when the alarm horn sounded, not the formal pattern that announced visitors, but the urgent, staccato blast that meant danger. The mess hall emptied in seconds, soldiers running for weapons and positions. Commander Thorne's voice boomed across the compound. "Raiders! Eastern perimeter! All combat-ready personnel to defensive positions!" My heart hammered as I grabbed a real sword, no longer relegated to practice weapons, and followed Sarah toward the eastern wall. Through the narrow windows, I could see smoke rising from the forest, hear the distant sounds of combat. Northridge sat on the kingdom's border, a strategic position that made it valuable and vulnerable in equal measure. Raiders from the disputed territories beyond had tested our defenses before, but never in force, never with real commitment. This felt different. "How many?" someone shouted as we reached the ramparts. "At least 50, a lookout called back. "Maybe more. They hit the forward patrol hard and fast." Thorne was already organizing the defense, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Archers to the walls! Infantry hold the gate! Medical teams prepare for casualties." His eyes found me in the crowd. "Winters! Observation post now! I need someone watching their patterns." I ran for the central tower, taking the stairs 3 at a time until I reached the highest point. From here, I could see the entire battlefield, our garrison's defensive positions. the scattered patrol members fighting their way back, and the raiders themselves, organized in a way that made my tactical instincts scream warnings. "Report!" Thorne's voice came through the speaking tube. "It's a feint," I called back, watching the patterns. "The main force is hitting from the east, but look at their formation. They're too spread out, not committed to a real breach. They want us focused there." While I scanned the western approach, and my blood ran cold. "West side. They've got a second force moving through the river approach. That's the real attack." There was a moment of hesitation. I could almost hear Thorne weighing my assessment against conventional military wisdom. Then his orders rang out. "Half the infantry to the west wall. Move." The next 20 minutes were chaos. Our forces split to meet both threats, and the raiders, realizing their strategy had been spotted, pressed their attack harder. I stayed in the tower, calling out movements and patterns, watching the battle unfold like a brutal chess game. That's when I saw him. A raider had broken through the western defense, moving with purpose toward the garrison's powder magazine. If he reached it, if he managed to set it off, the explosion would kill dozens and cripple our ability to defend. And he was going to make it. Everyone was engaged elsewhere, and the path was clear. I didn't think, didn't calculate odds or consider that I was still technically a recruit, still learning, still supposed to be an observer. I just ran. Down the tower stairs, across the courtyard, sword in hand and heart pounding. The raider was 30 feet from the magazine when I intercepted him, my blade meeting his with a clash that sent shockwaves up my arms. He was bigger, stronger, experienced. But I'd spent 3 months learning from the best, drilling until techniques became instinct, and I'd been taught by the Alpha King himself to use speed and strategy over strength. We fought in the narrow space between buildings, and I used every trick Thorne had beaten into me. Gave ground strategically, made him overextend, targeted his off-balance moments. When he swung hard, expecting me to block, I dropped low instead and drove my blade up through his guard. He fell, and I stood there shaking, barely believing what I'd done. Real combat, real consequences. Nothing like the training yard. "Elena!" Sarah appeared, blood on her armor but eyes fierce. "Are you hurt?" No, I'm fine. The magazine." "Safe because of you." Thorne saw the whole thing. She grabbed my shoulder, her grip tight. "You just saved half the garrison." The battle wound down as the raiders retreated, having failed to achieve whatever their objective had been. Our casualties were lighter than they might have been, in part because someone had spotted their true strategy and adjusted our defense in time. As I cleaned my sword afterward, hands still trembling slightly, I noticed Commander Thorne approaching. His expression was serious, but there was something else there too. Pride, maybe, or vindication. "That was well done, Winters," he said quietly. "Both the tactical assessment and the action you took. Though next time, perhaps call for backup before engaging an enemy soldier alone." "Yes, sir." "The King's monthly report is due tomorrow," he continued, and the faintest smile touched his weathered face. "I suspect this one will be particularly interesting to write." That night, I lay awake again, but this time not from nightmares or anxiety. I kept thinking about the moment I'd seen that raider heading for the magazine, the split-second decision to act rather than call for help. About the fight itself, how the training had taken over, how I'd moved without conscious thought. About the fact that I'd killed a man today, and while the weight of that action sat heavy in my chest, it didn't break me. I'd been forged in fire once, and barely survived. Now I was being reforged, deliberately, with care and purpose, into something stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. And somewhere in the capital, the Alpha King would read about today's events, and know that his investment, his strange interest in a half-starved recruit, had been justified. I found myself wondering what he'd think, whether he'd be pleased or merely satisfied that his tactical assessment had proven correct. Whether he ever thought about that rainy day 3 months ago, or if I was just another line in another report among thousands. The wondering should have felt presumptuous. Instead, it felt like a thread connecting me to something larger than myself, to a purpose beyond mere survival. Outside my window, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal, but I was no longer the girl who'd arrived here broken and desperate. I was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone worthy of the chance I'd been given. Winter came to Northridge like an invading army, swift and merciless. The first snow fell 6 weeks after the raid, transforming the garrison into a landscape of white and gray. Training became harder, more dangerous. Ice made the footing treacherous, cold made muscles reluctant to obey. But it also made us sharper, more aware, because enemies didn't wait for favorable weather. I'd been promoted to junior squad leader, a position that came with both pride and pressure. 5 soldiers now looked to me for guidance during exercises, trusted my tactical calls, followed my lead. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Elena, the Western Patrol is overdue," Sarah reported, her breath misting in the frigid air. She'd been promoted too, assigned to logistics coordination. 2 hours past their check-in, I frowned, studying the map spread across the war room table. The western route was considered safe, a routine patrol through Allied territory. For them to be late suggested either equipment failure or something worse. "Who's the patrol leader?" "Corporal Davis. Solid soldier, experienced, not prone to carelessness." Which meant something had gone wrong. I made a decision, hoping it was the right one. "Assemble a search team. 10 soldiers, winter gear, weapons. I'll lead it." "Thorne won't like you going out there. Thorne can overrule me if he wants. But Davis and his team are our people, and it's my responsibility now." The weight of those words settled on my shoulders, heavier than any armor. "Get them ready. We leave in 20 minutes. The search party moved through the snow-covered forest, with weapons drawn and senses alert. I'd chosen soldiers I trusted, veterans who knew these woods, who could read tracks and signs that would be invisible to inexperienced eyes. "There," one of them called softly, pointing to disturbed snow ahead. "Struggle. Multiple bodies." We approached carefully, and what we found made my blood run cold. The patrol had been ambushed, but not by raiders. The tracks surrounding the site were wrong, too large, too far apart, disturbed in patterns that suggested something moving on 4 legs rather than 2. "Wolves?" someone whispered. "Look at the size of those prints," another soldier countered. "No natural wolf gets that big." I'd heard stories, dismissed them as superstition and local legend. Tales of creatures that walked the border regions, things that were neither fully beast nor fully something else. The kind of stories nervous soldiers told in the dark to scare each other. Looking at the evidence before me, I couldn't dismiss them anymore. "Spread out," I ordered quietly. "Search pattern. Stay in visual range of each other. We find our people and we get out. Fast." We found Davis first, unconscious but alive, sheltered in a rocky overhang. His leg was badly injured, claw marks that had torn through leather and cloth. His 2 companions were nearby, in similar condition, hurt but breathing, protected by their heavy winter gear from the worst of the attack. "What happened?" I asked as we worked to stabilize Davis for transport. "Came out of nowhere," he managed through gritted teeth. "Massive things. Moved like wolves, but wrong. Smart. Coordinated. They were hurting us, cutting us off from retreat." He grabbed my arm suddenly, his grip surprisingly strong. "Elena, they weren't trying to kill us. They were driving us somewhere, like they wanted us to go in a specific direction." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Why would—" The howl that split the air answered my question. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, surrounding us, and it definitely wasn't natural. The sound carried an intelligence that made every instinct scream danger. "Defensive formation," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Protect the wounded. Weapons ready." They emerged from the trees like shadows given form, wolves the size of horses, with eyes that gleamed with unnatural awareness. 6 of them, moving with eerie coordination, creating a loose circle around our position. But they didn't attack. They just watched, waiting. Then the largest one stepped forward, and I understood why they'd been hurting us. The wolf stopped 20 paces away and changed. The transformation was fluid, impossible, terrifying. Fur becoming skin, 4 legs becoming 2, until a man stood before us. Naked despite the freezing temperature, covered in ritual scars, with eyes that retained the amber glow of his wolf form. A shapeshifter. The legends were real. "Lower your weapons," he said, his voice rough but understandable. "We mean no permanent harm." "You attacked our patrol," I said, keeping my sword raised despite the trembling in my arms. "Injured our soldiers." "We defended our territory," he corrected. "Your patrols have been ranging farther into the disputed lands. We sent warnings, marked trees, left signs. They were ignored." His amber eyes fixed on me. "So we escalated to ensure the message was received. These lands are under the king's protection." "These lands are under no one's protection," the shapeshifter interrupted. "They exist in the space between kingdoms, between the natural and supernatural worlds. Your king knows this. We have an understanding with him, one that your garrison seems to have forgotten." I processed that information rapidly, connecting pieces I hadn't known existed. The border wasn't just a political boundary. It was something more complex, a negotiated peace between different kinds of people, and we'd somehow violated it. "What do you want?" I asked carefully. "For you to return to your garrison and deliver a message." He gestured to Davis. "We could have killed your patrol. We chose not to, as a courtesy. But our patience has limits. The next time your soldiers cross into the deep woods, we will respond with less restraint. I'll relay your message, but you could have simply sent someone to talk to us. Violence wasn't necessary." Something almost like respect flickered in those amber eyes. "Your commander received 3 formal complaints through official channels over the past month. All were ignored. Sometimes violence is the only language certain men understand." He paused, studying me with unnerving intensity. "You're different, though. The one he's interested in." My heart stopped. "Who?" "The Alpha King. Word travels, even to those who live in the shadows. He inquires about you, ensures your progress is reported, makes certain you're protected and trained." The shapeshifter's smile was sharp. "Why do you think no real harm came to you during the raid? Why raiders who normally show no mercy suddenly retreated? He put word out that you were under his personal protection. Anyone who harms you answers to him directly." The world tilted slightly. I'd thought the king's interest was passing, a momentary curiosity about an unusual recruit. But this suggested something else entirely. Active protection, ongoing monitoring, a level of attention that went far beyond what any monarch should waste on a common soldier. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "Neither do most of us. But the Alpha King rarely acts without purpose." The shapeshifter turned to leave, his pack beginning to fade back into the forest. "Deliver the message, Elena Winters. And perhaps suggest to your commander that ignoring diplomatic communications is unwise, regardless of who they come from." He shifted back to wolf form in a single fluid motion and disappeared into the trees, his pack following like smoke dissolving in wind. The journey back to the garrison was tense and silent. We carried the wounded carefully, weapons ready for another attack that never came. The shapeshifters had made their point and retreated, leaving us with more questions than answers. Commander Thorne listened to my report with an expression that grew increasingly dark. When I mentioned the shapeshifter's claim about ignored communications, his jaw tightened. "They did send messages," he admitted finally. "I dismissed them as local superstition, animals making territorial displays that some overly creative scout interpreted as intentional warnings." He looked older suddenly, tired. "It seems I underestimated the situation significantly." "Sir, they mentioned..." "They said the king has some kind of understanding with them?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment. "There are agreements in place that predate my command here. Treaties negotiated between the crown and various non-human populations that live in the border regions. I've never dealt with them directly, always considered them a capital concern, not a garrison matter." He met my eyes. That was clearly a mistake. "What do we do?" "We pull back our patrols to the agreed boundaries, and I send a formal apology through proper channels. And then..." He paused. "I include this incident in the next report to the king. He'll want to know that his border treaties are being tested." After I was dismissed, I went to the garrison's small library. Really just a room with a few dozen books and military manuals. But buried in the back, I found what I was looking for, a leather-bound volume titled Supernatural Treaties and Border Accords. I read by candlelight until my eyes burned, learning about a world that existed parallel to the one I'd known. Shapeshifters who'd agreed to police the disputed territories in exchange for autonomy, witches who maintained magical barriers against darker things in return for protection from persecution. Creatures I'd never even heard of, all bound by complex agreements that the Alpha King had negotiated and maintained, and I realized why he might have taken an interest in me beyond simple tactical potential. The shapeshifter's words echoed in my mind. "Why do you think no real harm came to you during the raid? I'd thought I survived on skill and luck." But what if there had been invisible hands guiding events, ensuring I came through dangerous situations intact? What if the king hadn't just been monitoring my progress, but actively protecting it? But why? What could possibly make a monarch care so deeply about one struggling recruit's survival? I fell asleep with the treaty book open on my chest, questions spinning through my dreams. And in those dreams, amber eyes watched me from the shadows, sometimes human, sometimes wolf, always aware and always waiting. When I woke before dawn, frost had crept across the window in delicate patterns that looked almost like letters, spelling out words I couldn't quite read. The garrison was still quiet, soldiers sleeping off the previous day's tensions, but I felt restless, driven by questions I couldn't answer and connections I didn't fully understand. So I did what I always did when confused. I went to the training grounds and lost myself in the familiar patterns of practice, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become much more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, covering everything in white, and somewhere far away, I knew the Alpha King would soon receive a report about shapeshifters and treaties, and a recruit who kept surviving situations she shouldn't. I wondered what he would make of it. More importantly, I wondered when, not if, but when, I would see those amber eyes again. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt inevitable, like a story racing toward its conclusion whether I was ready or not. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow and revealing a world transformed. I'd been at Northridge for almost a year now, and the girl who'd stumbled through those gates seemed like a stranger. The hollow-cheeked, trembling recruit had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, tempered by training and tested by real danger. My squad had earned commendations for tactical excellence. The border patrols ran smoothly, respecting the treaties I'd learned existed, and every month, Commander Thorne sent his reports to the capital. I'd stopped wondering what they said, or at least I told myself I had. "Elena!" Sarah burst into the barracks, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this, now." I followed her to the main courtyard, where a crowd had gathered around a royal courier. He stood beside a magnificent gray horse, holding a sealed document that bore the king's personal insignia, a wolf's head crowned in silver. "Recruit Elena Winters," the courier called out formally. "Step forward." My heart hammered as I approached. Around me, soldiers whispered speculation. Royal couriers didn't come for ordinary soldiers. They came for promotions, commendations, or, my stomach twisted, for disciplinary actions. "Elena Winters," the courier repeated as I reached him. "By order of His Majesty, King Dmitry Volkov, you are hereby summoned to the capital. You will depart immediately, escorted by royal guard, for an audience with the king himself." He handed me the sealed document. "Your belongings will be sent after you. His Majesty requests your presence without delay." The courtyard fell silent. I stood there, holding the document, feeling the weight of every eye on me. Commander Thorne pushed through the crowd, his expression unreadable. "May I see the orders, Winters?" I handed him the document with trembling fingers. He broke the seal, scanned the contents, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or vindication. "They're authentic," he confirmed. "It seems your year of service has caught the king's attention in ways beyond our regular reports." He met my eyes, and there was warmth there I'd rarely seen. "You've earned this, whatever it is. Go, represent this garrison well." I had 15 minutes to change into my best uniform, say rushed goodbyes to friends who were torn between excitement and worry for me, and mount the spare horse the escort had brought. Then we were riding south, toward the capital, toward answers to questions that had haunted me for months. The journey took 3 days. The royal guards who escorted me were professional and courteous, but offered no information about why I'd been summoned. I I spent the hours in the saddle replaying every possible scenario, from commendation to court-martial, unable to settle on which was more likely. The capital city of Ravenmoor rose from the plains like a crown of stone and steel. Towers pierced the sky, walls thick enough to withstand any siege, and at its heart, the royal palace, a structure of such imposing grandeur that it made Northridge garrison look like a toy fortress. We entered through the military gate, and I was immediately whisked away by palace attendants who seemed to have been expecting me. They led me through corridors lined with portraits of past kings, each one watching with painted eyes that felt too knowing. Finally, we reached a suite of rooms that took my breath away. "You'll stay here," one attendant explained. "Fresh clothes have been provided. The king will send for you when he's ready." "When will that be?" "Could be hours, could be days. His Majesty keeps his own schedule." She smiled sympathetically. "Try to rest. You look exhausted." Left alone, I explored the rooms in a daze. They were larger than the entire barracks building at Northridge, furnished with luxury I'd never imagined, with windows that overlooked gardens so beautiful they seemed unreal. Fresh clothes hung in the wardrobe, not just uniforms, but formal wear, gowns of silk and velvet that someone clearly expected me to wear. I bathed, changed into simple trousers and a tunic, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Why would the king summon me personally? The reports could have continued indefinitely. If he wanted to promote me, that could have been done through normal channels. If there was a problem, Thorne would have handled it. This was something else, something that required my physical presence in the capital, in the palace, in rooms that suggested I'd be staying for more than a brief audience. Night fell. I watched the city lights flicker like earthbound stars and tried not to think about amber eyes and rain, and a voice that had said you learn faster than anyone I've seen in years. The summons came at dawn. A palace guard escorted me through a maze of corridors to a room identified only as the king's private study. He knocked once, opened the door, and gestured for me to enter. The room was smaller than I'd expected, lined with books and maps, dominated by a large desk covered in documents and correspondence. And standing by the window, silhouetted against the rising sun, was the Alpha King. He turned as I entered, and the year since I'd seen him collapsed into nothing. He looked exactly as I remembered, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and that scar running down his face, amber eyes that seemed to see through every defense I'd carefully constructed. "Elena Winters," he said, and hearing my name in that deep voice sent a shiver down my spine. "Thank you for coming, Your Majesty." I bowed, formal and proper, trying to hide how nervous I felt. "I serve at your pleasure, do you?" Something that might have been amusement touched his expression. "Sit. Please, we have much to discuss." I took the chair he indicated, and he moved to sit across from me, not behind the imposing desk, but in a second chair, reducing the distance and formality between us. This close, I could see details I'd missed before, the shadows under his eyes that suggested troubled sleep, the slight gray threading through his hair at the temples, the way his hands bore scars from old wounds. "I've read every report Commander Thorne sent," he began without preamble. "Your progress has been remarkable, from struggling recruit to squad leader in less than a year. Tactical innovations that have improved garrison efficiency, the incident with the raiders where you prevented catastrophic damage, your handling of the shapeshifter encounter, which could have escalated into a diplomatic disaster but didn't because you showed respect and intelligence." He paused. "You've exceeded every expectation." "Thank you, Your Majesty. But that's not why I summoned you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the intensity of his gaze made it hard to breathe. "I need to explain something. The day I found you in that courtyard, training alone in the rain, I saw something that—" He hesitated, choosing words carefully. "I recognized something in you, a quality I've spent years searching for, and rarely finding." "What quality, Your Majesty?" "The ability to endure." His voice was quiet but intense. "To face impossible odds and keep standing. To be beaten down by life and circumstances and still choose to fight rather than surrender. I saw a girl who'd lost everything but refused to let that loss define her limitations." He paused. "I saw someone like myself." The admission hung between us, intimate and unexpected. I'd never considered that the powerful Alpha King might understand what it felt like to be broken and desperately trying to piece yourself back together. Your Majesty, I don't understand. The treaties you learned about, the agreements with shapeshifters, witches, and other supernatural populations. He stood, moving to the window as if the conversation was difficult to have while facing me. They're necessary because this kingdom sits on a threshold between the natural and supernatural worlds. Maintaining peace requires a ruler who understands both sides, who can negotiate with creatures that see humans as prey and humans who see those creatures as monsters. He turned back, and something in his expression made my breath catch. I'm not entirely human, Elena. My bloodline carries something else, something that gives me strength and senses beyond normal men, but also marks me as different, dangerous, other. It's why I can maintain the treaties, because I stand between both worlds. His amber eyes glowed slightly, confirming what I'd already begun to suspect. And it's also why I've been profoundly lonely my entire life. The vulnerability in that admission shattered something in my chest. This man, this king who commanded armies and negotiated with monsters, was confessing to feeling alone. Until I saw you, he continued softly. Training in the rain, refusing to quit despite exhaustion and pain, and everyone telling you that you didn't belong. I saw someone who'd learned to survive in a world that didn't want her, who'd developed strength from necessity rather than privilege, someone who might understand what it means to exist between worlds, fitting fully into neither. You've been protecting me, I said slowly, pieces finally clicking into place. The raiders, the shapeshifters, all of it. I put the word out that you were under my personal protection, yes, because I wanted you to survive long enough to become what I believed you could be. He moved closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, smell pine and smoke and rain, but I couldn't just bring you to the capital immediately. You needed time to grow, to strengthen, to prove to yourself that you could thrive in this world. Needed to become the woman you are now, rather than the broken girl you were then. And now? Now I'm asking if you'll consider staying in the capital. Not as a simple soldier, you've moved beyond that. As a liaison between the military and supernatural communities. As someone who can help me maintain the peace that keeps this kingdom safe. He paused, and his voice dropped lower. And perhaps, if you're willing, as someone who stands beside me not because of duty or obligation, but because you choose to. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. You're asking me to... What exactly? I'm asking if you'd consider allowing me to court you, Elena Winters, properly, with time and care and the understanding that I'm offering you a choice, not an obligation. His amber eyes held mine. I'm asking if you're willing to explore whether what I've felt growing this past year, this connection, this recognition of kindred spirits, is something you might feel too. I should have been overwhelmed, should have needed time to process, to think, to carefully consider all the implications. But instead, I found myself remembering that rainy day a year ago, the moment our eyes met and something fundamental shifted in my world. Every report sent, every protection offered, every instance of being seen and valued for who I was rather than who I was expected to be. This powerful man, this king who stood between worlds, was offering me a place beside him, not out of pity or obligation, but because he recognized in me something he'd been searching for. I felt it too, I admitted quietly. That day in the rain, I thought I was imagining it, that it was impossible for someone like you to see someone like me as an equal. He stepped closer, and I could see my reflection in his eyes. You survived things that would have broken most people, learned in a year what takes others a decade, showed compassion to creatures that frightened you, and courage in situations where running would have been wiser. You've earned your place in any room you choose to enter, Elena, including this one. He offered his hand, palm up, leaving the choice to me. I thought about the girl who'd arrived at Northridge broken and desperate, believing she was worthless, about the woman I'd become through trial and pain, and the strange blessing of being seen by someone who understood, about the possibility of standing beside this man not as subject to king, but as partner to partner, building something neither of us could achieve alone. I took his hand, His fingers closed around mine, warm and careful, and I felt the rightness of it settle into my bones. This was the reason I'd survived. The reason I'd been guided here through paths I couldn't have navigated alone. Not destiny. I didn't believe in that. But possibility. The chance to become more than I'd ever imagined. "Then we'll take this slowly," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "You'll take the liaison position, learn the capital, meet the various supernatural ambassadors I work with. We'll spend time together as ourselves, not as king and soldier, but as Dmitri and Elena, and we'll see where this connection leads." "And if it leads nowhere?" I had to ask. "If we discover this was just curiosity or gratitude, rather than something real, then you'll still have earned your position here on merit, and you'll still have a life and purpose in this capital." His thumb brushed across my knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made my chest ache. "But I don't believe that's where this leads, Elena. I think we both know we've been moving toward each other since that rainy day in Northridge." He was right. I'd felt the pull even when I didn't understand it, felt the sense of inevitability every time Thorne sent another report, felt the invisible thread drawing us together across distance and circumstance. "Then I accept," I said, "all of it. The position, the courtship, the chance to discover what this is between us." Dmitri smiled then, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish, and I realized I was seeing something few people ever witnessed, the man behind the crown, vulnerable and hoping and willing to risk rejection for the possibility of connection. "Thank you," he said simply, "for taking a chance on someone who exists between worlds." "Thank you," I replied, "for seeing something worth saving in a girl who'd given up on herself." We stood there as the sun rose higher, hands clasped, two people who'd survived different types of darkness, finding light in each other's presence. Outside the window, the capital was waking, a city full of humans and supernatural beings coexisting because of treaties and understanding and the work of a king who stood between both worlds. And now I would stand there with him. The months that followed were a different kind of education. I learned to navigate court politics, to negotiate with shapeshifter pacts and witch covens, to translate between worlds that rarely understood each other. Dmitri courted me with patience and care. Walks through palace gardens, quiet dinners where we talked until dawn, gradual revelation of the person behind the crown. I fell in love slowly, surely, with a man who understood loneliness and strength in equal measure, who saw my scars and recognized them as marks of survival rather than weakness, who stood beside me when supernatural ambassadors questioned my authority and proved that he'd chosen me not for decoration, but for capability. 6 months after arriving at the capital, Dmitri asked me to marry him. Not in front of court or with public ceremony, but privately in the same study where he'd first offered me a choice. I said yes, not because he was a king, but because he was a man who'd given me back my life and then offered to share his. The wedding united more than two people. It symbolized the bond between natural and supernatural worlds, between power and compassion, between two people who'd found in each other something they'd stopped believing existed. I stood beside my husband on the palace balcony during the coronation ceremony that made me queen, looking out over a city of humans and creatures living in hard-won peace. Dimitri's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining, and I thought about the impossible journey from a muddy training ground to this moment. I'd survived. I'd fought. I'd refused to surrender when everything said I should, and I'd discovered that sometimes the broken pieces of ourselves can be forged into something stronger than we ever were whole. The crowd below cheered, and beside me, the Alpha King, my husband, my partner, my choice, smiled. Not the severe expression the world usually saw, but the genuine warmth he showed only to me. "Ready?" he asked softly. I looked at the city, at the future we'd build together, at the possibilities stretching before us. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." And I was.